Ladies and gentlemen, welcome and thank you for joining today's CIG Applicant webinar. Before we begin, please ensure that you have opened the WebEx participant and chat panels by using the associated icons located at the bottom right-hand side of your screen. Please note all audio connections are currently muted and this conference is being recorded. You are welcome to submit written questions throughout the webinar, which will be addressed at the Q&A session of the webinar. To submit a written question, select All Panelists from the drop-down menu in the chat panel, then enter your question in the message box provided and send. If you require technical assistance, please send a chat to the event producer. With that, I will turn the meeting over to Caroline Chironi. Caroline, please go ahead.
Great. Thank you so much, Michelle. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone for taking time out of your day to learn about the Conservation Innovation Grant Program. My name is Caroline Chironi, and I'm one of the program managers on this program. As well, I'm joined by my colleagues, Pavla Schumacher and Lucas Zakowicz, who also are program managers, and they will help me at the end of this session for the question and answer part of this session. But first, I'm going to go over some slides. I'm going to take about 25 minutes to give an introduction to this program. I'm going to actually shut off my video as well, just because of bandwidth issues, but I just wanted to say hi to everyone first. Okay, so it should stop now. Okay. So as a reminder, Michelle let you know that we will be recording this, and we will be posting this recording to our website along with a Q&A document that will come out of the Q&A session at the end. So it'll take us probably, though, about 5 business days to post that, just so you're aware. So today we're going to go over the component of the Conservation Innovation Grants program called what we call CIG Classic. Okay, hold on one second. I got to get used to. Okay, so the Conservation Innovation. Whoops, go. Okay. So the Conservation Innovation Grants program has multiple components. I'm going to review CIG Classic. We also have, which has a separate notice of funding opportunity. Throughout this presentation, I'll refer to notice of funding opportunities as an NFO, but that is basically what we've posted on grants.gov that many of you have already looked at. So today I'm going to do an overview of the program. I'm going to talk about how to apply to the program, as well as resources you can use if you are applying to the program. I'm going to review the priorities in the National CIG Classic NFO. As well, I'll go over changes from last year's NFO, and I'm going to go over pre-registration requirements, and then we'll have time for questions and answers. And when we get to the Q&A session, remember, you'll only be able to ask questions through the chat box, and you can enter those questions in at any point. Okay, I keep hitting return, but this doesn't work that way. So, CIG Classic. The CIG Classic program, the purpose is to stimulate the development and adoption of innovative conservation approaches and technologies on farms, ranches, and forest lands. I want to take a minute to distinguish the CIG Classic program from the On-Farm Trials program, because many of you are probably looking at both NFOs. The NFO for On-Farm Trials closes on June 21st, but the CIG Classic program, this NFO is open until July 19th. So you have until July 19th to submit your application. Now, the main difference between these programs is that the CIG Classic program is more about doing true development on innovation, where it's usually at the pilot stage of this development, where you have an idea of an innovation. There has been some pre-work done on that idea, maybe some research or a lot of anecdotal data collection or something. But there's something to go on, so it's not a super high-risk project. Whereas on-farm trials is a program that is really looking at scaling something that has already been piloted to multiple farms. So again, today I'm going to really focus on the SIG Classic program that is really more focused on doing pilot type studies. Now this year for the SIG Classic program, we have about $15 million to award to selected grantees. This is the same as what we had last year. Last year we received 100 applications and we were able to fund 24 of them. So to give you an idea of the rate of funding, it's about 24%, and we expect the same this year. The SIG Classic program, unlike on-farm trials, is actually open to almost everyone. It's open to all non-federal entities and individuals. So if you're a federal employee or you work for a federal agency, pretty much you can't apply to this program, but everyone else can as long as you're in the United States. As well, the program always has a maximum and a minimum amount of federal funding you can request. This year, the minimum has been raised to $300,000. So that means the minimum project total would be $600,000 because each project will need to have federal and non-federal match. And we'll go over that in a little bit more detail later. But the highest amount of federal money you can request is $2 million. So where to find the application package? If you have not already looked at the NFO, you can find it on the grants.gov website. So just go to www.grants.gov, and if you use this funding opportunity number that you see here, the USDA-NRCS-NHQ, if you put that full funding opportunity number into the search, you'll be able to quickly locate the NFO. But this year, the program has changed where you used to be able to submit your application to grants.gov, but this year, you will only be able to submit your application through what we call the NRCS CIG portal. Some of you may be familiar with this portal because the NRCS RCPP program also uses it, but for the first time this year, the SIG program also is using it. So we have the link here, and I'll go over this again in more detail later, but you'll need to register at this portal site as well as register for what we call USDA e-authentication. And we'll go over that again a little bit later. The application deadline, again, for this opportunity is Monday, July 19th, and you can apply up until almost midnight. So you have to get your application in at 11:59 p.m., and no late applications are accepted. I believe the ability to actually hit submit ends. So even if you try to submit your application, you would not be able to. So different resources. So you'll find when you get to grants.gov that not only the NFO is there, but we also have like a portal user guide and a few other forms that you can see. So that's one place that we put information, but we also post a lot of useful information on the SIG website. So if you Google CIG or SIG NRCS, the NRCS CIG website should pop right up, and you should be able to click in. And on the applicants page, so if you go to the left side of the main SIG landing page, you just need to click on the left-hand side, the applicants page. And on the applicants page, you'll see things like example project narratives, as well as other forms for information that can be useful. In addition, you're going to want to become familiar with the NRCS SIG portal page. Actually, the image on this slide, on half of this slide, you'll see is of that portal page. But you'll need, all applications this year will need to be made through there. We will not accept any applications through email. So you will need to get access to this site and become familiar with it. So now I'm going to go through the national priorities for the SIG Classic program this year. For those of you familiar with the SIG program, you'll know that every year the SIG National Classic program changes their priority areas. So for instance, last year we had energy efficiency, air quality, and wildlife habitat as priority areas, but this year we do not have those topic areas. And so if you have a subject area that's more directly related to those, the current priority areas may or may not fit your idea. I would like to emphasize that any idea you have has to fit into one of these priority areas. It takes a great deal of time to put together a SIG application, so we recommend that you don't apply to a priority area if you really aren't a fairly direct fit. For instance, sometimes people try to fit things like wildlife habitat into a water quality priority area. But if you don't have a strong water quality component actually to that priority area, the competition is stiff enough that the panel reviewers are not going to rank it very high. And so we really recommend that you only apply if you do have a fair amount of, if you're able to truly address that priority area. So this year we have 5 priority areas, and the first one is water resources and increased resilience, climate smart strategies. Basically, this is a program focused on water quality and water quantity related to climate change. So if your priority, if your idea doesn't really fit into that, we recommend you not apply. But if it does, we really hope to see a lot of applications for that area. As well, we have as our second priority area, soil health, climate mitigation, adaptation, and resilience. Again, this is a climate change focused priority area, but there's 2 sub-priority areas for this. There's carbon sequestration and climate resilience as it relates to soil health. So again, if you apply for this, you will need to fit into those areas specifically. As well, this year we have a nutrient management priority area that's focused on improving nutrient management adoption to meet watershed or regional water quality goals. So what's interesting about this priority area is there's a technological component as well as a sociological component. This priority area is interested in solving the nutrient management problems in our country any way it can, and I think the ideal proposal would really include both aspects. There should be a sociological component as well as a technical, but that would be an ideal proposal, and we are open to either types of solutions. As well, this year we have the grazing lands conservation priority area. We've not included grazing lands for several years, so this priority area is pretty wide open, and it actually, most ideas will fit into it as long as they're related to ranch land or pasture land. As well, this year, our last priority area is the increasing conservation adoption priority area, and this is divided into 2 sub-priorities. The first one is social science and producer landowner decision making. This is a real sociologically focused priority area that's really trying to get at producer incentives, like trying to understand producer decision making. Why are producers or are not adopting certain conservation practices. As well, increasing conservation adoption has the sub-priority of conservation finance and incentives. So overall, this is a less technological priority area and covers incentives and sociological questions that other priority areas do not. One thing I want to warn people about, though, is sometimes we get applications that are not really focused on innovation and they're just doing outreach. Often people want to apply to this priority area for those types of projects, but again, if there isn't a strong, innovative idea, we ask that you not apply. This is not a program that funds just outright outreach or EQIP conservation practices. There's other parts of NRCS that do fund those types of programs. So last but not least, I wanted to say that if you address more than one priority, you will need to select a main priority. So it's very common for projects to address multiple conservation practices, but if you do, you will have to select one main priority on your application, and that is the priority in which that panel review team will review your application. So every application can only get reviewed by one panel review team. And there is a panel review team for each priority. Okay, so let me go over eligibility and requirements quickly. Some of these I've already covered, and the first is, again, that federal entities and federal employees should not apply, but pretty much the program is open to any other entity or individual in the United States. The other really important eligibility is that each project needs to bring to the table a non-federal match of cash or in-kind or both. Most projects will need to bring at least 50% of the total project cost. That means if you're asking for $300,000 of federal funding, you will need to bring to the table another $300,000 of non-federal money from your own organization or partner organizations. And if your partner, if the money is coming from partner organizations, you're going to want to be sure that you have a commitment letter that very clearly states a commitment by this organization that they can bring this match to the project. But this year we have change in match. So if you're applying for what we call the historically underserved set-aside, which is available to project teams that are focused 100% on historically underserved groups or are from a historically underserved organization, they only have to bring forward 33% of the total project cost as non-federal match. That means if they're applying for $300,000 of federal money, they only have to bring forward $150,000 of match. So the next thing I wanted to emphasize is that each project must present an innovation. And the SIG program is very loose with the definition of innovation, but again, it is a requirement. And when you look at the technical criteria for the program, innovation accounts for about 25% of the points that the reviewers are assessing each proposal for. So it's a very, very critical part of this program. So if your idea cannot be considered innovative as defined in the NFO, probably not a good fit for the program. And the last element that sometimes our applicants forget about is that each project has to involve EQIP producers. So, or EQIP eligible producers, I should say. They don't actually have to be on the EQIP program. They just have to be eligible for it. And what this means is it doesn't mean that you have to be doing part of the project on producer land necessarily, but EQIP producers have to be involved in the project in some way. They have to be involved in like a workshop or training, or maybe there's a decision team, but somehow they need to be involved, and that needs to be described. So now I'm going to go over the changes and updates from the in this NFO from last year's NFO. So, of course, I've already mentioned we have new national priorities. As well, we have a project minimum this year of a $300,000 federal ask, which last year it was only $150,000. So this year we're really looking for bigger projects that can really have a little bit more impact. As well, the biggest change this year is that we're moving application submission to the NRCS portal from grants.gov. So you will not be able to submit an application through grants.gov or email. You can only submit it through this portal. And to do this now, there's basically 4 certifications or registrations, like pre-work that has to be done. And I'm going to give you a slide that outlines each of those. But traditionally, you had to get a SAMS number. And now you will also have to do, in addition to those, e-authentication and SIG portal registration. So that's 4 things that have to be done beforehand in order to submit an application to the SIG portal. Now, a lot of the forms that you would traditionally fill out that would be available on grants.gov are now in the portal. As well, the way the portal is set up, it's you're going to be filling out a form in order to submit your application. So traditionally, people would do their project narrative in a Word document, and it would be one document that would be about 15 pages, and that document would include figures and tables. Well, now your figures and tables will need to be uploaded as a PDF to the application. And the project narrative itself will be divided out. Each section of the project narrative, such as objectives, background, deliverables, will have their own box. So what we recommend is you fill out your narrative in a Word document first, save it, and then copy and paste into the portal. Okay, as well, another change is this year we ask that your start date is around March 1st, 2022. We don't anticipate being able to get agreements completed until then. Again, we would plan to announce awards in November or December, but the agreement process always takes us at least 2 months. So if you're new to applying for SIG grants or federal grants, I recommend you take a screenshot of this page because it has the links for all the pre-registrations that are required for the SIG program this year. So we recommend that you plan ahead about 3 weeks. So by the end of June, make sure you've started these registrations. And I believe you can actually do the USDA e-authentication and start on the SIG portal before you actually have received your DUNS and SAMS number, but you will not be able to apply if you do not get these. So we ask that you start this process at least 3 weeks in advance. Now, if you already have a DUNS and a SAMS number and they're not expired, you're set. You don't have to reapply. As well, if you're already e-authenticated, you don't have to reapply. You can, USDA e-authentication applies to all USDA programs that use it, so you would not have to get it again. I'm going to go through a few project narrative hints. I'm going to probably shorten this because I'm running over a little bit. But basically, we ask that when you write your project narrative and you submit that information to take time to review it and do a really good editing job. Make sure to take time to do extra editing because often people don't realize that panel reviewers can be biased if a document is not well edited. As well, it's really important that everything is clear. For instance, goals and objectives should be very clearly outlined. And your objectives should feed into your goal. Your objectives should support your goal. And those terms, objective and goal, should not be confused or reused within the document. For instance, we've had problems with proposals where they actually give us 3 different sets of objectives within the same document. And something like that becomes very confusing, and they're just explaining things and they're not taking the time to use a different word. But for us, that gets very confusing because we don't really understand the point of the project. So take time to reread your document at least 2 times. As well, one of the things that becomes really important is to explain the project impacts and outputs. And those are really different things. Project impact is really goes beyond the life of the award. It's really what the idea you're presenting, what can be the impact to society at large or the agricultural industry at large. You know, we want to know that, and usually that's an estimate, and sometimes that won't even be clear by the end of the study. But we want to have an idea of how this can actually impact conservation. And that's really different than tangible outputs for a project or deliverables. So make sure both of those things get explained. The last thing I want to bring up about project narrative is that often people apply for the CIG program, and the money they're asking for the CIG program is actually part of a larger project they're involved in, and they're just trying to get funding for part of that project. So this is another situation where often people are not very clear about where the boundaries are between what is being funded by the CIG project and what is being funded by the project at large. And we ask that in the background section you be very clear about that, because again, this is one of those things that I think people sometimes are consciously vague because they think that they can, you know, show that all these deliverables can happen from this project. But when the panel reviewers start looking at it, things don't add up. So it actually works against these people usually with their projects. So we really ask that you really clearly outline that if you are asking for money for a much larger project than what the CIG project would cover. Okay. Okay. I don't know why, but this got really large. I'm not going to go over budget narrative hints, but I'll just leave it here for a second if someone wants to do a screenshot. I think I'm kind of running low on time, and I want to make sure that we are able to answer everyone's questions. But basically, there's a budget and a budget narrative, and make sure you spend a lot of time on the budget narrative. I think the budget visually is just a table, and I think people might end up spending a lot more time on that because it takes up more space in the portal. But the budget narrative is really, really the more important part. So make sure you take time to really spell that out. Normally, that is a document that's at least 4 pages long, just to give you an idea. Okay, so if we're not able to answer your questions today, please feel free to send any questions to this NRCS CIG email box I have posted up here. So with that, I think we can enter into the question and answer session. If Lucas or Havila can help me, I think Havila, you're going to read the chat box.
Yep, this is Havila. I'm on the line. Looks like we've had a very active chat while you've been talking, so I will try to get through as many questions as we can in order. I think there are some duplicates, but a lot of really, really good questions here. So first question is, applications must have work that takes place in the United States. Does that include the territories?
Yes, that includes the territories. Yes, U.S. territories are definitely included for the CIG program.
All right. Next up, where can a document specifying grant guidelines and instructions for formatting or required sections be found?
Well, what's interesting is we now have the CIG portal. So each of the sections have a limited word number. And I believe, actually, Havila, you can help me with this one. I believe if you copy and paste from a Word document, it will put it all into the required font automatically. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah, that's right. So
yeah.
the controlling set of instructions is still the notice of funding opportunity. Everything that you're going to need to enter in the portal for the project narrative anyway, is in that funding announcement. So we do strongly encourage you to draft answers in advance so that you're not stuck, navigating through a computer program and trying to draft your answers that way. There were several questions. Yes, thanks, Caroline. There were several questions related to priority areas. So one asked if you have to address both sub-priorities, and there were several questions similarly about whether you could address multiple priorities in your application.
So you do not have to address both sub-priorities. For the 2 priority areas that have sub-priorities, you most likely will only address one. That's what's expected. Now, you can address both if it makes sense for your project, just as you can address multiple priority areas. And it's actually very common for proposals to address multiple priority areas. But again, if your project will be competed against other projects in that priority area that you select as your main priority area. And so you're still going to need to make it compelling to that priority area, okay? So I think that that's the challenging thing is sometimes if you have multiple priority areas, you want to make sure that the main priority area that you select isn't diluted, that the project overall is still very compelling. Hopefully that helps.
Great. Thanks, Caroline. All right. Next question related to the priority area, an application question. If you have 2 separate technologies that you want to test out, one is focused on water resources, say, and one is a decision-making support tool, can you submit 2 separate applications, one for each technology, or multiple applications okay?
Yes, multiple applications are fine. You can even submit multiple applications to the same priority area. If they're 2 completely different ideas, it's probably a good idea.
Yeah. All right, great. This one we might need to get to in a longer Q&A document, but I'll try anyway. Melinda asks, can you expand on the stated preference in the RFP for proposals that includes an economic analysis? So we're talking about that, I think, that last conservation adoption priority, and can you talk a little bit more about that economic section?
Yeah, actually there is an economic section in multiple of the priority areas, and so I'm not really sure which, are you sure they're asking about the 5th one? Because I think we mentioned that in several. It's in the grazing land, as well as the 2 water resource priority areas. And those 3, oh, what was that?
Oh, I was just going to say, Melinda, if you're out there, if you want to clarify in the chat, I'll try to get to that.
Okay. She said the water priority area. So the idea here is that I think there's just a lot of awareness that in general, when producers are working with conservation practices, a lot of the motivation is economically related. And because of that, at this point in time, we want some economic information. Unlike on-farm trials, we're not being very prescriptive on what that economic component needs to be. And again, the people reviewing the project, we might invite an economist to the panel, but because the panel is about water quality or water quantity, most likely your reviewers are going to be experts in water quality and water quantity. So, economics is going to be a side piece of it, and there will be a lot of flexibility as to how that's incorporated. But gaining some sort of information related to farm finance really is what they're asking for.
Okay, super. Thanks, Caroline. A specific question about where anaerobic digestion might fit within these priorities.
Well, anaerobic digestion, I think it could fit in nutrient management or the, you can't do straight anaerobic digestion without adding a component to your study that includes some level of water quality monitoring, nutrient management monitoring, or even soil health monitoring. But I could see anaerobic digestion fitting in several of these priority areas, but it can't be standalone. It would have to have a strong component that really met the priority area. But obviously, anaerobic digestion is related to nutrient management once the product is applied, so, and water quality. So, and it can affect soil health. So basically, it could fit, but you need to have a strong team that can do monitoring on these other components to meet the priority.
All right, great. Moving right along. There's a question about whether the slides will be available for participants after the webinar. Answer is yes. Caroline, anything else you wanted to provide? I think it's going to be a couple days before these go up. Is that right?
Yeah, but I can just email the slides to everyone too. I believe we'll get email addresses, but if not, if you just email the NRCS CIG inbox and ask me, I'll email you the slide deck.
All right, great. A couple questions about match popped up. The first one is from Joshua. For in-kind contributions, do salary and infrastructure costs matched by the applicant institution count toward non-federal match?
Absolutely. Salary and infrastructure can, I guess when you say infrastructure, it's like the rent on a building, I guess, or if it's a piece of equipment, it's like, the rental of using that equipment. So that's how I'm interpreting infrastructure. But yes, those are normal elements that can be applied to the non-federal match.
And Joshua, if you have questions about specific costs for your project, definitely reach out to us at the inbox and we can dig in a little bit more about some of those costs. From Omar, another question about match. So Caroline, can you just go over the kind of the one-to-one match and the 33% match, those numbers again, how that all works out?
Right. So I didn't go into detail about historically underserved groups yet. So I'll just go into it a little bit more here. But the CIG Classic program puts 10% of the total funding aside specifically to be applied to groups that apply for this historically underserved set-aside. So there's only 4 types of organizations that can really qualify, and basically they're organizations that are either about historically underserved groups, run by historically underserved groups, or serve historically underserved groups. But that group is allowed to commit a smaller amount of match. But other than that, most of the people applying are going to need to do what we call at least a one-to-one match, which means if you're asking for $500,000, your team is going to have to provide at least $500,000 of non-federal funding that go towards the total project cost. If you're asking for $750,000 of federal money, you're going to have to bring at least $750,000 of non-federal funding to the project. So the total project cost in that case would be at least $1.5 million, if not more. But if you're a historically underserved group or qualify for the historically underserved set-aside, you would be required to provide just 33% of the total project cost. So again, if you're asking for $300,000 of federal match, you would only have to provide $150,000 of non-federal match. Because the total of those would total $450,000. So the $150,000 of non-federal match is basically a third of the total. So hopefully that clarifies it. And if you have more questions on that, just email us. Okay, next question.
All right, great. Zooming right along. So for the historically underserved set-aside, does the applicant or the it says the target or the project executor, so I'm assuming this is that the applicant or participants need to be historically underserved to qualify for that side.
Well, there's several scenarios that are allowed, and it's spelled out in the NFO in section, I think it's like D5. So if you go to the, if you just go to the table of contents, you'll be able to click on the historically underserved section and get there quickly. But I just suggest that you read it, or if you email me, I can copy it, but I don't want to read it all out because it's a very clear definition. It's like a paragraph. And there's 4 different groups that would qualify, types of groups.
Sounds good. Matt asks, where can I find a list of existing EQIP producers? And I think we might want to qualify eligibility a little bit here.
We don't provide something like that. You know, we are interested in people building their own relationships for the project. You know, I think that you could probably work with local organizations, nonprofits that deal with ag producers, or maybe contact your extension service or even NRCS office because they might know producers that have a particular interest in projects. But that's something we don't provide.
Okay, great. This one's pretty straightforward. When are grant recipient announcements expected to be made, award announcements?
We expect to make announcements in late November, early December.
Okay, great. Can the result of the grant be sold on the open market?
Technically, yes. So we ask that you review the patent section of the NFO, but for most federal grants, we follow the normal legislation, which is what we call 2 CFR 200. But basically, by the end of the award, if you produce a product, you are allowed to earn income from that product, and but NRCS does retain a royalty-free license. So we don't usually put too much focus on that, really. I think most people have been able to move forward with their products fine, but we do retain that.
Great. So question that definitely came up last year, if federal partners are involved in the project, example given USDA, ARS in partnership with state agencies and universities, what role can the federal agencies play? Clearly not the lead fundee, but can they be co-PI or receive any funds?
Okay, so a federal agency can be involved in a project, but their time cannot lend to the non-federal match, and they cannot receive federal funding from the project. So we have had multiple projects in which co-PIs have been from federal institutions, but their time has not been on the budget, basically, at all. So, you know, it's a risky because if they're a major part of the project, you can't show commitment, basically.
Great. I'm reading through some of these. I see some what appear to be questions that we've covered in spirit about match and about historically underserved producers. So going to skip those. If you don't hear the answer to your question, folks, reach out to us via email or ping us again in the chat. Question from Adam is, historically, are there any trends in scope, like how many farms are involved, how wide a geographic area to involve, any advice about how big or broad the project needs to be?
You know, not really. I would say that reviewers like to see like things on farms. You know, they like things piloted on farms, but We always will fund a project here and there that does not have that. Like maybe it's only doing something on a research farm or something like that, as opposed to a producer's private land. I think the most important thing is to just make sure your project makes sense, because panel reviewers pull these things apart. And, if you're trying to make it seem like something that it isn't, that's not going to work. They're gonna see through that. So as is reasonable, if you have a small team, you don't want to do a large project, right? So just be practical and be realistic about costs, and they'll call projects out for being too costly or being underfunded and things like that. So just try to be as realistic as possible and ask for what you need, because if you don't ask for what you need, that can be viewed as a weakness as well. So just try to make your project design as good as possible.
All right. Looks like we got just 5, 6 more maybe. We should have time to get through. Can FIG funds be used to seed a revolving loan fund or a loss reserve fund?
Sort of. We do have conservation finance projects, and the funding can be used towards loans during the life of the project. But can that money be used in a revolving fund? I'm not sure that would be allowed, actually. So, because I don't know, like with equipment and stuff, that equipment ends up being owned by the federal agency. But I think with a revolving loan fund, you might be able to keep it, but I'm not sure. So if you don't mind emailing our inbox, I'm going to try to get a better answer for you on that. It's a really good question.
All right. Let's see. So there was a question about outreach. We kind of talked about that adoption priority, but Adam says, hadn't been thinking about workshops before he mentioned it. Are outreach efforts favored beyond any on-farm research? Do we want our projects to have an outreach component?
I think most projects have outreach components. I'll leave it at that. They don't have to, but that's usually a concern of the reviewers. Again, this is not fundamental research. The CIG Classic program is not like people who apply for fundamental research are applying to like NSF and NIFA. We don't do fundamental research. This is applied research. So even though it doesn't have to have an on-farm component, it, or I'll say private land on-farm component, it usually panels better, I'll say. But again, if an idea is compelling enough, it might not matter.
All right, thank you. Let's see, moving right along, there were a couple of questions about the number of funded projects per priority area. Is that roughly proportionate? Is there a set number of projects? How does that work?
Traditionally, we have funded based on the number of proposals that have come into each priority area. So, usually the priority area that gets the most proposals ends up getting the most amount of money to fund projects.
Great. Let's see. Nick asks, should the budget showcase the total cost of the project broken down by what would be matched versus federal grant, or how do we delineate that in the ask? I'll go ahead and take this one. Yes.
Okay.
And you can add on, Caroline, but the portal actually has 2 separate sections with some logic built in to make sure that you have asked for enough match versus federal spending. As Caroline mentioned, though, the budget narrative is really the key piece. So we will require you to break it down, but your description of how that money is spent is really the most important thing. Caroline, I don't know if you want to add there.
Yeah, you do have to break it down by year, though. I think that's, you know, that's something that we really ask for, that the breakdown is done by category, and we do have the specific categories in the table and year. So, but other than that, yeah, I don't.
Let's see, 6 minutes, 5 questions, I think. Do state universities that are an HSI or HBU qualify as a historically underserved agency, or does that have to be an agency that serves underserved growers or ranchers? I think you kind of covered that earlier, Caroline, and a lot of that is in the NFO, but if you want to take that here.
Yeah, I mean, any historically underserved college or university in the United States would qualify. HSIs and 1890s, and there's several other historically Black, all those groups.
Great. For contractors, should contractors be pre-identified, or can the applicant state that they're going to enter a bidding process for contracts they're awarded?
It really depends on the proposal. They do not have to be identified, but if they're a large part of the project and the panel cannot review their credentials, it can be viewed as a weakness. But if it's a small part of the project, it's probably not significant.
Okay, great. Are resubmissions ever encouraged? How often are they successful if resubmission addresses previous reviewer comments?
So we do have resubmissions that are successful the second time, and I don't have a percent for you. We don't actually get that many resubmissions, but I have seen them funded. That's about all I can say.
All right, sounds good. Let's see. This is maybe the biggest question, and it's coming at the end. Caroline, could you expand on what innovation is? Okay, so innovation, it is sort of defined in the NFO, and it's defined in that it doesn't really define the obvious part of it. Of course, innovation is something new. But for CIG, innovation also includes moving an idea that may function in one part of our country or even in another country that has not been tried or has not caught on in another part of our country and actually testing it where it is not currently used. So that does qualify for innovation, but some of those projects are not as compelling. Some of them are. Sometimes that can actually make something even more compelling, right? If something really works well in one part of the country and it's completely being ignored in another part of the country because no one wants to test it out, they're just assuming because of the soil type or the climate it's not going to work. Yeah, the innovation is really something that can be impactful, right? A change, a new way, a new method, a new technology, or even a new approach. With our projects that are sociological, it doesn't have to be actually a technology. So the program is very open, but really what we're concerned with is getting conservation on the ground in our country and what can help move that forward, new ideas that can help move that forward. Hopefully that helps. Great. That helps me, but we'll see. Okay, so the question is about conservation finance, but I think we can broaden this. So the question was, how does a pilot program work for conservation finance? Are there examples of past funded programs? Let's expand that just a little bit. If our applicants want to see past examples of funded projects, where would they go for that?
So on our website, and we are developing this. I don't think, Lucas, if he's still on, he could maybe help us, but there is a way to look up past projects, Right now, there isn't a lot of information, but for some of our older projects like pre-2017, a lot of the final reports are on there. And we have had a lot of conservation finance projects. So you could probably see some of those on there. If you email us, we could try to help you maybe search that out. We could give you the link actually to the database where those are stored.
Great. I think we're just about at the end. There's a question about applying to 2 separate priorities. And again, your organization can submit multiple applications to different priorities. There was a question earlier that I didn't ask about on-farm trials versus SIG Classic. You could apply to on-farm trials and SIG Classic as long as they're different projects. Again, they just do need to be clearly different projects, and we wouldn't fund the same work twice. There's a question about Caroline's email for the slide deck. I think the best thing to do is the slide that's in front of y'all that has nrcssig@usda.gov. If you email that address, one of us will get it for sure, unless, Caroline, you wanna give your email too. But I think that bucket's probably the easiest place.
I agree. I think this is easy for people to remember too in case they lose it, and it's on our website. So very specific questions will just get forwarded to me anyway from that email address. So when I reply, you'll get my email.
All right. I think we're at the top of the hour. That wasn't every question. Again, I think some of them were answered in earlier. Some of them seemed a little bit specific, so don't hesitate to reach out to us. But Caroline, I'm going to stop talking and let you wrap up.
Great. Thank you, Havila. Thank you so much for helping us get through these. So feel free to reach out to us. Thank you so much for taking your time, and we really appreciate your interest in our program. And we'll try to be as available as possible to help you out, and we look forward to seeing all your great ideas. Have a lovely day.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.